Hello, 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 and welcome back. Today I'm exploring the performance of pain, how visual vulnerability or victim mindset take on emotional power plays, and how visual vulnerability can be a doorway to real connection or a mask for toxic shame. Because here's the truth, it's not always what it looks like. Sometimes it's a call for healing. Other times it's a play for control. Real vulnerability says, this is where it hurts. Will you meet me here? And toxic shame says, look at my pain. Now you owe me. Two people can show their wounds. Only one wants to heal. So when I share the stories inside this episode, one is about someone who connected honestly and one who used performance as pain. I want you to hear the difference. Same surface, very different intention. So let's get into it. The performance of pain.
I'm looking for a woman in finance. Crypto 5 amber eyes. I'm looking for a woman in finance. Crypto 5 amber eyes. I'm looking for a woman in finance. Crypto 5 amber eyes. I'm looking for a woman in finance. Crypto 5 amber eyes. I'm looking for a woman in finance. Crypto 5.
Welcome back to Uncharted, the podcast where we rip the map right out of your hands and ask, who gave it to you in the first place? I'm your host, Lisa Ann Edwards, and you know who I am by now, so I'm not going to run through that all today. I hope you do anyway. So today we're exploring something sharp and uncomfortable, how some people use pain to connect and others use it to control, and how you can tell the difference between visual vulnerability and victim mindset. Because sometimes the person crying the loudest isn't the one who's hurting the most. They're the one keeping you from healing.
I'm looking for a woman in finance. Crypto 5 amber eyes. Uncharted. Let's go.
This week, my friend sent me a photo of his leg, mid-leg press at the gym, and I replied, "Aw, what happened?" I wasn't expecting the usual gym injury story, as I knew he had surgery, but I thought it was an old knee injury. But what he told me actually stopped me in my tracks. The timing of it was wild because earlier this week I'd already been researching something called visible vulnerability for this exact episode. And suddenly he was living it in real time. So now he's in shape, always at the gym, but that's not the point of this conversation. Something really fascinating happened to him last week. See, up until recently, no one ever spoke to him at the gym. We were messaging about this a little while back, the whole challenge of making friends in later life, and I suggested meeting people at the gym. He's always there, common interest. And I remembered Mel Robbins' Let Them Theory, especially the chapter on friendships, because he had told me no one talks to him. No one talks to him at the gym. No one even looks up. Everyone's got their headphones in, eyes down, train and leave. But then he had ankle surgery, showed up to the gym with a full cast, crutches, and a clearly visible injury. And suddenly it was like he became human to people, not just the buff guy at the gym. Everyone wanted to know what happened. Everyone who had walked past him for 6 months without as much as eye contact now had something to say. He wasn't invisible anymore. Then he went to the pub and he told me it took 30 minutes just to leave because 3 separate tables stopped him to ask what happened to his leg. And it hit me. People don't see you until they can see your pain. They don't reach out until you're visibly wounded. So throughout this episode, I'm going to explore 2 very different expressions of vulnerability I witnessed this week. One was open, grounded, and deeply human. The one I just shared. And the other looked similar on the surface, but underneath it was something entirely different. The contrast is why this conversation matters, because sometimes what looks like vulnerability is really performance. And sometimes that performance becomes manipulation, not to connect, but to control. It made me ask, what happens when our pain isn't visible, when vulnerability becomes theatre, when someone starts using their pain not to heal, but to hold power over the room? That's what we're unpacking today. Visual vulnerability, the victim mindset, and how to flip the script so your pain doesn't become someone else's playground. It's the emotional equivalent of conspicuous compassion. Pain used to gather attention, not growth. And while it may look like vulnerability, what it's really doing is bending the room around performance, not to connect, but to control. It brings to mind something Brené Brown says, that vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, not weakness, but courage in its purest form. And that hit home for me. I used to think vulnerability meant just showing up, just showing emotion, crying, being open to your past. I thought it was enough. But real vulnerability has boundaries. Not everyone gets a front row seat. And it's not collapsing into someone and calling it closeness. It's letting someone see you and still holding yourself in the process. That's the lesson I had to learn the hard way. By offering real vulnerability and watching it get punished while someone else performed pain to keep control. So let's break it down. What real vulnerability actually is, and what victim mindset really does, and how to step out of those roles for good. What is visual vulnerability? So visual vulnerability is the look of pain. Crutches, a cast, tears, trauma stories, cryptic Instagram captions. It's what stops people in the street and gets attention and sympathy. Conversations about how you can be fixed and how you can be repaired, but sympathy all the same. But here's the thing, some people are visibly hurting and they're genuinely open. They're seeking support and healing, and others, they just use that same power to pull people in, not to grow, not to connect, but to control how others respond to them. It's the difference between I'm hurting, can you witness me, and I'm hurting, now you owe me something. So real vulnerability, as Brené Brown teaches, requires mutuality, boundaries, and trust. Without that, it's not honesty. It's a performance. Sympathy seeking without accountability isn't openness, it's control. The distinction is crucial. Authentic vulnerability invites connection and growth, while performative displays can be manipulative, drawing others into a cycle where they feel compelled to rescue or fix, rather than engage and in a mutual trusting relationship. So first, I'm going to break down visible vulnerability for you. 1. Visible vulnerability invites empathy. When someone sees an obvious injury, crutches, a cast, a bandage, it triggers an ancient social reflex. Humans are hardwired to respond to visible signs of pain and weakness because historically group survival depended on caring for the injured. Your injury became a signal. I need care, I need attention. Suddenly, strangers who might usually scroll their way past feel permitted and compelled to engage. 2. It breaks the social script. Most of us walk around in autopilot, eyes down, mind on task, and our own little bubble. But an injury disrupts that bubble. It's a visual cue that interrupts the normal rhythm of interaction. People don't know what to say when passing somebody normally, but an injury gives them a reason to speak without it being awkward. It's the same reason people will talk to you if you have a cute dog or a newborn, and it creates a shared social moment. 3, it makes you relatable, even if it's uncomfortable. So when you're injured, people see humanity. You're not just another polished stranger walking past. You're someone who's clearly going through something. And whether they admit it or not, most people have been there, sprained something, broken something, fallen flat on their ass in public. Your struggle makes you accessible. 4, some people unconsciously like being the rescuer. There's a psychological role some people naturally take on, the helper or the fixer or the rescuer. And when they see an injury, it gives them an opportunity to step into that identity. It makes them feel needed, even if it's just offering sympathy. 5, it changes the power dynamic. When you're healthy and confident, walking with purpose, people may interpret that as you being self-sufficient or even intimidating. But when you're visibly hurt, it levels the playing field. You're no longer perceived as fine on your own. You seem more approachable, even if you don't want to be. You might just want to be in your own world, but people are going to come up to you like they did to my friend. So metaphorically, it's like a cracked vase in a gallery. People suddenly stop to notice what they normally would overlook. The flaw becomes the focus. The pain becomes the permission to connect. So the problem isn't that you're suddenly more interesting. It's that we're living in a culture where pain is a passport to presence. and people have forgotten how to connect without needing a wound to point to. So what if vulnerability isn't about connection at all? What if it's a tool for control? So using vulnerability as a weapon is a classic covert narcissist tactic, often referred to as vulnerable narcissism or covert victimhood. And here's how it works. How a covert narcissist uses vulnerability is really interesting. They don't always seek admiration through grandiosity. They seek attention, sympathy, and control by presenting themselves as perpetually wounded. Their pain becomes their power. They might share intense stories of suffering to draw you in emotionally, appear emotionally raw and deeply self-aware, but without reflection or growth. Use vulnerability as a manipulation tactic to make others feel guilty, obliged, or wrong. They shift blame by crying, shutting down, being avoidant whenever they're confronted. They use their pain to reclaim the victim seat when they've acted poorly instead of taking accountability. So the cycle looks like they get caught in a behavior that hurts others. Instead of taking accountability, they collapse into victim mode. You feel bad for confronting them and become the villain. The dynamic resets, and now you're the one apologizing. That's not vulnerability. That's emotional manipulation. The important distinction is real vulnerability says, this is where it hurts. I want to grow from it. Covert narcissistic vulnerability says, this is where it hurts. Now it's your job to make it better. So yes, using vulnerability to manipulate others is rescuing, overfunctioning, or doubting themselves. And that's a hallmark covert narcissist move. The victim mindset can be seductive to a covert narcissist or an avoidant with narcissistic tendencies. Let's define that. This is not necessarily just a full-blown narcissist, but an avoidant with manipulative tendencies or narcissistic tendencies, because it offers attention without accountability, emotional power without emotional responsibility, and it lets them stay in control by looking like they're falling apart. It's power hidden inside their pain. It makes them feel like the world owes them something while excusing them from any responsibility for what they've done. I've seen it. I've been caught in it. And if we're honest, most of us have. The real shift comes from recognizing when someone's living there and understanding why. I've loved people who've stayed in that place, and wow, do they settle in? They seriously settle in. You show up with love, with solutions, with presence, and they weaponize their pain like a shield. Every conversation becomes how they were wronged. Every boundary you set makes you the bad guy. They're not asking to be understood. They're asking to be rescued without reflection. The victim performance is like an Oscar-winning event. So there was this time in my life where I deeply cared for someone. We shared dreams, built things together, held a vision of who they could grow into, maybe more than who they actually were in that moment. What I didn't see clearly at the time was the difference between vulnerability and the performance of pain. They often appeared open, raw, even fragile, but over time I noticed that what looked like emotional expression didn't always come with reflection or accountability. It was more about how their pain shaped the room and how it shaped their growth or lack of. There were moments of silence that felt really heavy, emotional lows that took up all the space and dragged me down with it, and stories shared not to build connection, but to subtly direct attention, care, and control. The underlying message seemed to be, I'm struggling, so everything now must bend around that. You must bend around that. You must see me. And I responded with love, with empathy. I thought that if I held space for their pain, maybe they'd make room for mine. That if I kept showing up softly, patiently, consistently, we'd eventually meet each other in the middle. But instead I started to lose myself. I was doing the emotional labor for both of us. I was constantly adjusting, holding it together, trying to be strong for two people. And when I finally voiced my needs, gently, calmly, honestly, the dynamic shifted. Suddenly I was too much. Too emotional, too sensitive. And I started to question myself. What I've come to understand in this is some people aren't trying to manipulate you on purpose. They're just deeply unpracticed at facing their own pain. So they externalize it. They seek comfort before clarity. They ask to be rescued rather than to be witnessed. And it doesn't make them bad people. It just makes them not ready for a relationship. And it doesn't mean you were wrong for loving them. It means you reached your limit for trying to heal in that space that wasn't built for mutual care. And this can often be that anxious avoidant dynamic. And that's the real difference between performance and presence. One draws attention and the other invites connection. So if we're flipping the script from drama to empowerment, how do we do that? First, we stop confusing visible pain with honest vulnerability. We have to ask ourselves, is this person growing through this pain, or are they inflicting pain to avoid growth? Usually you'll know the distinction. You'll feel it in your bones. It's cruel because that distinction will save your soul. One is the path to healing and the other is a masterclass in emotional avoidance. Second, we exit what psychologists call the drama triangle. So this is really important. It's a model developed by Stephen Cartman in the 1960s, and it shows up in almost every toxic and dysfunctional relationship dynamic, especially when one person is locked in the victim mindset and the other is unknowingly doing the emotional labor for two. The drama triangle consists of three roles. One, the victim. They look like poor me. They see themselves as helpless, targeted, unable to affect change. They avoid responsibility. They seek emotional validation instead of solutions. Victims attract rescuers, and when that rescuer eventually burns out or speaks up, they reframe them as the persecutor. They see themselves as helpless, and they seek emotional validation over real solutions, avoiding accountability for their own healing. 2, the rescuer. That's the person that comes in and goes, let me help you. That person will overfunction, try to fix them. They find their identity by being needed, often highly empathetic. They're overextended themselves trying to heal, love, or prove their worth through emotional caretaking. These are the people that often get on the other side of this dynamic. They neglect their own needs and their boundaries just to keep the peace. They find their worth in being needed. They overextend, fix, and lose themselves trying to manage others' emotions. This role is especially common for women with unresolved childhood fawning patterns. Those learned survival instincts that were pleasing, appeasing, and avoiding conflict became ways to feel safe. So in trauma bonds, fawning often shows up as an overfunctioning, overcaring, and losing yourself in the process. And if you don't know what that is, it's one of the 4 trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And fawning means you abandon your own needs, boundaries, and voice in order to appease, please, or avoid conflict. These women, sometimes men, often stay safe in relationships that feel emotionally or physically threatening. So they stay there, and that's how they stay safe. So this is serious. What is the nervous system link? Because this is an overlooked sort of verbal abuse, maybe even physical abuse is happening, and these women are just backing down and accepting this because fawning is a dorsal vagal survival response, a trauma response, not a personality trait. It's a nervous system saying, I can't fight, I can't flee, I've got to keep the peace, I'll play small. I'll give them exactly what they want so I don't get hurt. It looks like love, but it's really self-abandonment dressed as connection. And believe me, I'm right to call it serious because fawning is one of the most insidious and least talked about trauma responses, especially for women raised to prioritize harmony over honesty. And it's often the reason women stay in relationships that are quietly or overtly abusive. And often they've witnessed this in their childhood. It's a learned behavior. And then there's 3, the persecutor. This is your fault. Authoritative, controlling, passive aggressive. They criticize, shame, dismiss to feel powerful. But here's the issue. The rescuer or even the victim can flip into the persecutor when they feel threatened, abandoned, or unheard. They criticize, shame, or control to feel powerful. They might be overtly harsh or subtly passive-aggressive. Often that impulse to criticize or control comes from a deep fear of losing power, not malice. They're not doing it on purpose. They're just trying to gain some of that power back. But here's where it gets psychologically messy. The persecutor isn't always the villain. Sometimes it's a rescuer who's burned out for overgiving, or the victim who feels unseen and lashes out. It's like an emotional musical chairs. We switch roles when discomfort hits, each trying to avoid the one seat we fear the most: accountability. So understanding these shifts is what allows us to step out of the triangle entirely. Because healing isn't about picking a better seat, it's about completely leaving the game. When love meets avoidance, sometimes relationships reveal not only the beauty of connection, but the gaps in our own healing. Deep relationships can resurface deep wounds, and often both people in that dynamic carry pain, just not always in the same willingness to face it. So some people want to heal, others just sit in that pain. And there are times when one person becomes the emotional anchor, going to therapy, doing the inner work, reflecting, growing, and in contrast, the other person remains stuck in a loop of avoidance, stories, and emotional overwhelm. So it's easy to fall into the belief that love alone can heal that gap. And if you're patient, kind enough, understanding enough, the other person will eventually meet you there. But healing isn't something we can do for somebody else. It has to be chosen, owned, and committed to. So when pain is used as a shield instead of a doorway to understanding, it creates imbalance. And that's what that power dynamic is and why it flips. So when someone externalizes their suffering and turns their partner into the emotional outlet, it's no longer a relationship. It becomes a survival strategy. Love can't thrive when one person is carrying both hearts. So emotional manipulation doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. A change in tone, a refusal to take responsibility, a deflection disguised as humor, or a sudden shift that leaves you questioning your own reality. These moments chip away at self-trust, and over time this can leave one person doing all the emotional labor while the other resists reflection. What might feel like strength, holding space, giving grace, staying hopeful, can turn into self-abandonment. Real love invites growth, not performance. Real love honors boundaries, and it doesn't break them. It's not uncommon to confuse volume with power. We get louder when we're being dismissed. We raise our voice, not to control, but to be heard. That reaction is deeply human, especially when the silence feels like you're being erased. But over time, the most powerful shift isn't getting louder. So if you're an anxious attachment and you're suddenly in this dynamic where you're getting louder, what you want to do is walk away. Walk away. Your power is in walking away, in choosing peace over potential, in speaking once clearly and let the rest go. When you learn the power of walking away, that's when you'll find peace. So this isn't about casting blame. It's about recognizing the patterns and breaking them, because this dynamic and this drama triangle can be broken. We can't force others to grow, but we can grow ourselves. We can choose clarity over chaos, self-worth over storyline. We stop explaining, we stop defending, and we stop performing our pain to prove it's real. And instead, we rise quietly, steadily, without apology. And even when no one claps, even when they rewrite the story, even when it would be easier to stay silent, we speak. Not to be loud, but to be whole. Not to hurt anyone, but to stop ourselves hurting others. We stop waiting for someone to choose us, and we start choosing ourselves. Healing doesn't begin when someone else sees your worth. It begins when you do. If someone from the past ever wants a seat at your table, they need to come healed, not holding the same pain that once cost you your peace. This isn't revenge. This is you releasing them. Let the door stay open to growth if you want, but closed to chaos. Because love is not meant to feel like survival. And worthiness is not something we prove. It's something we remember always. You are worthy of love. You're worthy of peace. You are worthy of being heard. So you don't need to raise your voice to do that. Sometimes we stay longer than we should, and we love from our wounds. But we can forgive that version of ourselves, the one who didn't know. So potential means nothing without action, and intentions mean very little without accountability. Pain is not a hall pass to avoid growth. You cannot carry two people through one healing process. And this isn't about shame, it's about responsibility. Let that other person heal themselves and come back whole. And this isn't about judgment, it's about having boundaries. It's not about giving up. It's about coming home to yourself. So if this episode touched something in you, opened you up, trust that. And if it felt like your situation, that's the mirror. Sit with that. This is your invitation to choose yourself fully, with clarity, with courage and love, and to no longer mistake chaos for depth. If you want to see what I built from clarity, take a look at coinrunnersmovie.com. So it's a story about power, identity, survival, and what it takes to rebuild after a misaligned trust. That film, like this podcast, was born from one decision: to rise, to stop bleeding from stories that I never deserved, and they don't deserve a second act. Because if nothing changes, nothing changes. This isn't an episode about someone else's failure. It's about freedom. We don't point fingers. We face the wound. We do the work. We reclaim our own story. And just in case no one told you today, I see you. I hear you. You are not alone. If you've made it to the end of this episode, I thank you so much. I thank you for your time, your energy, and your willingness to look beneath the surface. If this landed somewhere deep, if it stirred something raw, let that be your starting point. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to start choosing yourself over the chaos, over performing, or over emotional debt. So you're allowed to choose peace, to protect your energy, to walk away, not because you don't care, but because you do. You can love someone and still let them go. That's the real flex. Quiet strength, clear boundaries, love that does not cost you your sanity. So if you're in that dynamic and you're getting louder and louder and louder, know that you're not alone. I've been there a couple of times, actually many times. I have had relationships with avoidance my whole life. And it's only now that I'm learning that love needs boundaries and clear boundaries. And you don't need to raise your voice to get your point across. And walking away is the strongest thing you can do. I just want to bring this up because there's a saying that gets tossed around a lot. If you love someone, let them go. If they come back, they're yours. If they don't, they never were. So I'm rewriting that because while it sounds poetic and it sounds nice, it can seriously mess with your head if you're walking through attachment wounds, anxious loops, or trauma bonds. It turns love into a test and healing into a waiting game. So here's a more grounded version that actually honors growth. If you love someone, you don't try and control them. You let them be free and you watch what they choose. Because real love isn't about gripping harder. It's about standing in your truth and seeing who can meet you there. So when you set them free, are they choosing you? Are they actually choosing you? Or were you fighting to be chosen and you're not getting chosen? So that's what happens when you let go of control. So if you want to go deeper, see what I've built from this and check out coinrunnersmovie.com. It's in its early infancy and we're just attaching actors and actresses at the moment, and I'm thinking I'm going to have some big news soon on this. It's not just a film, it's a reclamation of a story born from fire, from survival, and from the radical choice to write a new ending for myself. So the link is below, and if this episode felt like your mirror, share it with someone who needs to hear this. Post it, tag me. Let's make it safe to talk about what's usually hidden. You're not too much. You're not broken. And you're not alone. You're the perfectly packaged parcel just delivered to the wrong address. You are a woman rising, not in spite of your pain, but because of it. And your voice is not only welcome here, it's needed. I'm Lisa Ann Edwards, and this has been Uncharted. Until next time, keep choosing yourself, as always. And don't forget to check out my links and come and say hi. Love you guys. Catch you next week.
Uncharted. Let's go.